Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deacon and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name's Andy Littleton. I'm sitting with Eric Deacon. We are with Mission Church in Tucson and the Village Church in Tucson, respectively. And today we jumped in and talked about The Closer by Dave Cheppelle at first, and then we talked about a lot of other things, including we did get back to gender. We talked a little bit about church and Christian school.
And deacons.
It's
a compelling podcast.
It
really is.
It is.
Yes.
It is. It's the true Faith Over Breakfast that where we sat down and we began to talk, and we talked about a whole lot of various things that are all very relevant to your life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So enjoy.
Yeah, so a couple things to note. Number one, we promise that if you were promised a book, which would mean a couple of you that we've promised books to, and Colleen will give you your book. So we got to pick a book for her.
Yes. Ooh, right.
They will get to you by the end of the year. Number two, if you send us an email at faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com and you say, hey, talk about this thing, we'll send you a book from our bookshelf.
That's
All
right.
you got to do is email us.
That's right.
And tell us what you want us to talk about and give us your address.
There it is.
We will send you a book. It's only in the United States, so sorry, listeners Brazil, listeners Japan, listeners in Belgium, and all those other places. We aren't mailing out.
We'll send you a book recommendation.
We can send you a book, but we'd love to hear from you. So if you're in Brazil, hey, email us. Or in Europe, I know you listen. Email us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Those in Antarctica?
Yes, Antarctica listeners.
Yes, please reach out.
I don't know if we have any, but hey, if you're there, send us an email.
All right, here goes the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Check. Hey, Eric.
Hey, Andy. Good to see you.
Yep. So, I watched the Dave Cheppelle special.
I once believed that I watched it, but obviously when I rewatched it, I was disgusted and couldn't imagine that I watched it.
So you believed previously that you watched it, and now you're not sure you did watch it.
I think I fast forwarded through a lot of it.
Yeah. Okay.
And I did that again.
Okay.
Because the opening joke was enough for me to be like, oh gosh, I don't think I can do this.
Yeah. I legitimately afterward thought two things. First, I thought he is a very talented comedian. And then I thought I need to pray before I go to bed.
Yes.
Because that was like, there was a lot of really rough stuff in there.
So this is the Netflix, his last one, I guess, for a while, called The Closer.
Right.
And Dave Cheppelle is a comedian, African-American comedian, who's gotten himself in a little bit of trouble with Netflix.
Oh, well, I don't know if he got himself in trouble with Netflix as much as
with transgender community.
And I mean, it's almost as if I don't think he, so having listened to the entire body of work last night, I don't think he accidentally got himself in trouble. I think he had a very specific thing he wanted to get across that he worked out throughout the time, and he ended with it. I mean, he had a very specific thing to say, and that thing to say was that it felt to me that he thought that the African American argument for freedom had been supplanted by this movement.
Yes, and this is an argument that was going on in the early 90s when I was in college doing,
Right.
all of this good kind of postmodern philosophy and intercultural. I was in cross-cultural social psychology was my major at the time. So yeah, I was.
Right.
This is something that was a serious conversation.
Yeah. So how'd you experience it there? So there's obviously the Dave Cheppelle edition. I think that he did briefly suggest that the feminist movement might be being supplanted by it as well.
Yes.
But
I
his
think so.
big argument at the end was it really had to do with the African-American community. That's how he landed it.
Right.
Yep.
And I think that isn't being discussed in the news.
No.
What's being discussed is what he said about the transgender movement and the connection to J.K. Rowling, right? That's how you say her name.
Yeah,
the Harry
Rowling.
Potter author.
Yeah, and I would say that the special is clearly framed as one entire conversation, and so as with all things, we shouldn't piecemeal. We should look at the whole of what he was saying. Now, what the whole of what he's saying includes a lot of things that are extremely vulgar and it's by no means a Christian argument. But if you want to understand what Dave Cheppelle was trying to say, you can't do sound bites. You have to take the whole.
Right.
But anyway, so that was my takeaway was that he was trying to make an argument to show that, I mean, he was saying, he said, you'll essentially take on the persona of an oppressed person until it's time to be white again. And then you'll use that to your advantage. And that was like, ooh, Right. I mean, he had some strong things to say about race. And he was utilizing the LGBTQ movement to exhibit that the race movement, how far the race conversation has not gone. So that was interesting.
Right. Yeah, and I think that I agree with you. And there's a whole bit about being gay that he's building this all together. Yeah. I do think, though, that if you just take his one little conversation that everybody's kind of up in arms in, it illustrates that, because what he is saying is that he's taking what the author of Harry Potter said. Is it Rowling? Is that how you say her last name?
J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, J.K. Rowling, and saying, she basically said that transgender men basically are usurping the feminist movement and undermining it. And so undermining women who are in a powerless position or unable to, like, saying that that's void. Like, it's not an issue anymore.
His summary of what she said was that the idea of gender is a fact. And that's essentially his summary. And part of, I would assume, why she was saying that. Now, I'm going to admit right now, not as up on her position. But if you're going to take the feminist movement seriously, femininity has to be a fact.
Right, it has to be a fact.
If it's not actual, then the feminist movement becomes kind of null and void.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
And so he was, I mean, that's part of the building block of his whole argument. But that's where people are up in arms, particularly at Netflix, the transgender people who are protesting or were protesting things.
Yeah, I mean, he does like simultaneously, and this is the whole, what is a comedian allowed to make fun of conversation that I think actually Jerry Seinfeld engages a lot with in Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. I think that's one of his subtle objectives, is to talk through, that the role of the comedian is that they should get to make fun of anything.
Right.
That is a critical piece of
being a comedian.
And of argument, and of public discourse in a way.
They're what we have left of public prophets, good and bad.
Right. So if you say that a comedian can't make fun of X, Y, or Z, you've undermined the very idea of the comedy, of like what a comedy is for. Right. So that, if I had to summarize Seinfeld, and seems like Cheppelle's after that too, because he simultaneously says things like, look, I'm not hateful, I'm not against, but then there's some like jokes about, very, very derogatory jokes toward that community. Seems like he's trying to aim them at, he'll aim them at anybody.
Yes.
Is kind of his thing, right?
Right. Well, he says that sometimes the mean thing is the funny thing, right?
Oh, right.
So that's what and he's a comedian.
Right.
So that's, I think, I think the transgender movement, so gender fluidity movement, has taken precedent over the African-American narrative. The gay and lesbian narrative, it's kind of supplanted both of those as oppressed people, the feminist movement.
Right.
So I think this is a pushback on that.
Uh-huh.
And I think a lot of there's a category of people in the world who I would call older liberals, so Gen Xers
Right.
and boomers, who are upset at this new liberal movement and what it's doing to oppressed people, basically.
Yeah.
It's basically there's one oppressed person, and that's the person who is fluid in their gender.
Yeah, or the most oppressed person is the person with the most categories checked. So if you're,
so we call it,
So if you're transgender, that is a major category, and that like a black male, for example, only checks one box.
Right, and there's the box checking, but there's also just who controls the narrative,
right,
in the public square.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unless we're in a spot where Black Lives Matters and there's protests going on, their narrative is not in the public square.
Right.
And that's pretty much the only way that the African American community can become part of the narrative anymore, in my mind.
Is to jump in with that.
And be really loud.
Mm-hmm.
And yell and protest.
Right.
To remind people that, we still live under some form of oppression.
Right.
I'm not saying it's right by any means. I'm just saying this is a reality.
That's how it works.
Yes, it or not, this is the way it is.
I think, when I've tried to discuss such things over the past couple of years, that's what I've been trying to help people process, is not which is this like right or utterly biblical. Just I am a pastor. I am very concerned with what is biblical and right, but also just to help people understand what is. Why is this happening?
Right.
And then you can go about saying, so what could the church do? But yes, that is what's happening.
Right. And I would just say, excuse me, to reverse a little bit, I would not recommend people watch this.
Yeah. I would say,
unless you are having conversations with non-Christian friends who are watching this and really it's powerful to them and they're in a conversation about it.
Yeah, it's not. I agree. I wouldn't say it's recommended watching unless I think there's a category of person that if kind of sexually explicit stuff is tough for you, just steer clear. And if you think you could listen objectively to try to understand the argument so you can have a discussion with somebody, that's one thing. But it's
not entertainment that you should be watching to be entertained. Right.
Yeah, it's not even, it is comedy, but it's very clearly more, and it is extremely vulgar.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So be warned as we talk about this.
Yeah. No, I agree. Like I said, I did laugh. He's funny and he's a master of delivery.
Uh-huh.
When it comes to like the art of comedy, like master. But there was a lot where I was like, I don't like that thought is in my mind. Like I could have done without that. So yeah, all that. Watched it with my wife, which I think was good. I mean, better than
My wife was in for like 2 minutes of it and she got up and left.
yeah.
She's like, I can't listen to this. And I was like, I can't listen to this either.
Yeah.
This is just gross.
I think my wife and I both had our moments of cringe and our moments of going, oh, that was funny, and like back and forth, and then kind of at the end going, okay, that needs to be unpacked. But it was very late, so we
didn't unpack.
Not really. It was like the 20-second unpack.
Right. Yeah. So, but I think the thing that we probably want to talk about is, so what is this? What should we, as followers of Jesus, be thinking through as our culture kind of, in some ways, reacts to what he said?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I agree. I mean, let's throw out some options that people might engage in. One would be people might say, as Christians, that was awesome. What would you say to somebody that was just like, he has such good points, that was awesome?
I would say I couldn't watch that because it was disgusting.
Yeah.
That would be the first thing I would say. But then I would say, okay, let's take a look at what his points were and let's walk through it and think about it.
Right. I think I would be somewhere in the boat of going, I know what you mean, because there's something compelling about hearing somebody who seems to be not afraid. But that was far from Christian. Like he wasn't claiming to be, and it was just so obviously not the way of Jesus, the way that he spoke. Even if he was right about a thing, please show me where Jesus took an approach like this. I mean, even in his harshest criticisms, not like this. And so it does not exemplify the way that a Christian should speak, even about people who are, wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that would be one option. Another option would be, this is what's wrong with the world. Like
Dave Cheppelle is what's wrong with the world?
Yeah, or his transphobia, or
oh, right. He's a typical Gen Xer.
And to say he has there's nothing in there that was of this is just he should be
right.
He should be done. We should never hear his name again.
Him. Yeah, we should get rid of him. Yeah, well, I think. I mean, okay. A lot of this has to do with us going back and doing some work on the gospel, because I think I had a conversation with my wife, and we were yesterday morning. So before I tried to review this again, and I was coming up with titles of articles and books that I would write if I had time. Yeah, and one of them was how the church's position on gender has caused the transgender movement.
Yeah, interesting.
And then we were making jokes. It was the 10 ways the church has made its approach to gender. That's, yada, yada. And you won't believe number 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we were coming up. But I do think our approach to understanding who we are as male and female historically, and the way that we've worked that out within the church, is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And part of why people are struggling right now is that what the church has given is rarely something that's attractive and rarely something that's compelling to what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And so I think we have, in a world where there's a lot of confusion, we haven't given a lot of way into helping people understand who they are.
Now, I could imagine somebody saying, and my head goes here too, does it matter that it's compelling, or does it just need to be true? And are those mutually exclusive to you?
No, actually, truth is always compelling because it's embodied in Jesus. So therefore, my gender and how I understand it is understood in Jesus, and Jesus is compelling. Right. So therefore... What about
the offensive side of Jesus?
The offensive side of Jesus? Yeah.
I'm just inviting further reflection on it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, who usually gets offended by Jesus? The religious leaders.
Yes. I've noticed this.
So,
It jumps when you read the New Testament over and over.
Who's offended?
Yeah.
Not the prostitute.
Yeah.
She's not offended.
It's the Pharisee.
It's a Pharisee.
Yep.
So usually if internally the church is not offended and externally everyone else is, then probably we're in the wrong place. We're not following Jesus.
I mean, there were probably a lot of people, if you were to say, like in the days that Jesus walked around, who just weren't, a lot of people followed him, a lot didn't. A lot just weren't compelled. But it seems like the people who found him most compelling and attractive, it was because of his grace, and his gracious word, his forgiveness, and he doesn't seem to, come at them. And there are statements, go and sin no more, and Zacchaeus is going to, repay everything, but they seem to happily do it in light of what they've been given, rather than like feeling like, oh man, what, and then the Pharisees who put heavy weights upon people, Jesus seems to just, he offends them deeply.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess, just historically from 4th century on, the church, especially when it comes to understanding who you are as a woman, I mean, they were removed from any kind of leadership in church. And then, you go to Augustine, who basically theologically we all go back to for some reason. He didn't believe women bore the image of God without a man.
Right.
And you can trace that all the way through history. But then what you find is that men are put in a category, and this is what men do, and this is how men are, and this is what women are. And they're very difficult categories to fit into.
And I have noticed that they aren't necessarily as biblical as we've thought.
No.
Such as the man is the provider. I'm not real clear on where that comes from in the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of different things that we look at it in these. And so so we aren't really in the conversation because we just keep talking about, well, this is either like who you are in a diminished state, or this is who you have to be a man, or this is what makes you a woman,
right?
And we're not talking. So the world's talking about other things.
Yeah.
And we're talking about things that they just don't understand. And so I do believe that we have nothing to say to Dave Cheppelle. We have nothing to say about, when you go and look at how the Bible was used by the African Americans during slavery and the white church, they're two separate, one's justifying slavery and the other is seeing, a narrative of freedom through Exodus and a hopefulness in their oppression,
right,
that God's going to deliver them. And you've got the other people justifying their position because there's no real prohibitions against things in their minds.
Right.
And so again, we're in the wrong place in the dialogue, I think, in some ways. So we don't have a lot to say.
Yeah.
And that's really disappointing to me, because I actually think Jesus has a lot to say about these things. And so, so when it comes to the whole transgender thing, we're on this, what makes us male and what makes us female.
Right.
And that conversation is one that we should be having with people. And how do you, but we have to ease our way in. We can't just come in like a hammer because we don't have a platform anymore.
So if you were to add a couple of thoughts into what makes us male and female, where would you start?
Well, I think we should end the podcast now.
Yeah.
No. So I think first, this may sound odd. I think we have to stop talking about some of it, and we need to begin to invite people in to experience it.
Sure.
Because I do think
it's not just talking points.
Yeah. Because talking points are, I can come with a gentle and kind way of helping people understand the fullness of bearing God's image as male or female. And we can look at Genesis and the beauty of the narrative there. And there's some just gorgeous things that go through the whole scriptures of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man and how you reflect God's image. And those are good, and they're interesting conversations, and they're helpful at some level. But if you don't taste it, and then you're not gonna know it. And so some of it is, how do you find out what it means to be a man or a woman? And you don't know that, you follow, you go and you invite people to come be part of it and to see it and to taste it.
I'm trying to look at a recent podcast that I listened to because it kind of exhibited this a bit, and I don't know how to use my phone.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Well, while you're looking, I mean, I think that's the other part about the reason I would say the church has kind of exited the conversation of gender is that we just hide in a hole. We're so terrified that our culture is going to, influence us in a bad way, or I don't know. We're unwilling to invite people in and just experience what it looks like to love one another in Christ.
Right.
And because I think too, we're Americans. I think the American church, because of the Puritan influence and a lot of other things, is we are a very judgmental culture as Christians. We judge people instead of inviting them in and letting them taste what's good.
So okay, back to that, inviting them in. So I was the podcast was Gospel Bound. It's a Gospel Coalition one. And so Blair Lynn was the guest with Colin Hansen on there. And so she's written a book about not having a father around. Right. And one of the two profound things that she shares that really changed her life were, number one, being invited to live with a Christian family. And so not so much being taught, here's what fathers do, but just experiencing a family that walked with her. And then the other thing she said she experienced was a church community that was full of mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers.
Yeah.
And those were the things she didn't point to a book. She wasn't like, I read the book on, manhood and womanhood or something. As I experienced a family. And I thought that was a simple illustration of what you're saying, inviting people into something. And here's somebody who years later says, I've been changed. And who knows what points of view might have been had if it hadn't been for that. Right. And it wasn't literature or a talk or a comedy sketch, for that matter. Right. Which is an interesting thing about, the Dave Cheppelle special. I doubt, as we're dealing with in Christianity, the people who were offended before are more offended now, and the people who agreed before just have a new weapon. But did it change a heart? Did any heart change?
No.
I sure don't think so. I didn't feel like it had that kind of power.
No, it might have bolstered people, connected people.
Yeah, who were already
in that position.
Already there. But no change occurred. And that's, I think, the question for us is, when we're thinking of the transformative power of the gospel, is not how do you rally all the people that already agree to build a wall against X, Y, and Z, or how do you drive away the people that don't agree already? And, that wasn't Cheppelle's stated purpose, but no. But at the same time, I think that's the effect.
Well, I think he's a little angry. He's upset that the African American narrative has been usurped, and that is a problem in our culture. But
he expressed it. He said his piece. Mm-hmm. But again, did the people who he was offended with have anything to sit back and go, I'm being transformed?
No. Though I do think maybe an unintended and maybe an intended consequence or whatever, and a good consequence in the sense is, you and I are talking about it. We're pastors. Yep. So when people who are leaders of communities say, hey, the African American narrative has been usurped, and that's not right. Right. That has influence. And yeah. I think that's good. And I think we have to think about that.
Because nothing even yeah, I would agree with you that there are side causes and effects that can be positive even from a negative thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and I think what happens in the church is that we become very the same in a sense. So I was trying to think of the word that homogenous, I guess, is the word. And so we don't begin to look at our own communities like Mission Church. Within Mission Church, there are people who are marginalized. Right. They're not just marginalized in the public in the public sphere. They're probably even a different set of people who are marginalized in your church because of your church. Right? They're not they're on the outside.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the early church, and you see this with widows, is what they said is take the marginalized person, move them to the middle of the church, and then we surround them and function around them, right? Because widows were a big issue in the early church, particularly the Greek church. And so
they ordained a whole class of servants just for them.
Yes, and then they started ordaining those widows, right? There's a list, an order of widows who were over 60. So they're in the center. They're the ones that are being cared for. They're being given voice. The question I think we're not used to in our culture, like saying, at Mission, at Village, who's actually marginalized? What's the marginal stories? Mm-hmm. What are we called to do to bring those into a place where they're secure and safe? Because if you're on the margins, either emotionally, physically, or financially, or spiritually, you're going to be in a place where you can be taken advantage of.
Now, this is a legitimate question here. So I think part of a movement that I sense today is that, and this doesn't seem like something that was there when I was younger. It used to be that you tended to kind of want to claim that you were fine.
Right.
And today it feels more like you want to be part of the marginalized group.
Interesting.
I'm serious. Like the idea, there's a lot of speak about like, what about me and what about, and I identify in this way that is very, like there's people are latching on to the idea of being in the oppressed group who never would have been considered so even 20 years ago.
Right.
And so that's an interesting, so then you're like,
I
deciding between oppressed groups is a new challenge.
I have two thoughts on that.
Yeah.
One, sometimes it's an awakening to the oppression.
I'm actually not trying to argue utterly again. I'm just
answering. So
no, I know.
So I would say one of the things that over the last year, my wife as a woman has been awakened to in the church is how the removal of power from her and the way that men have basically over the last 40 some odd years of her life discussed what she would do and how she would do it and what the right way to do it is very marginalizing and disempowering, and has changed the way she thinks about herself. She didn't really realize that.
Yeah.
So there's that.
So there's the awakening to something that was actually there.
And then I would say that you can never teach and encourage a community to surround the marginalized people within it until you teach people that they are marginalizers. So all of us marginalize one another and we oppress. And so you have to own your oppression before you can own your being marginalized.
Okay. And that's a very key piece.
Right, because as a sinner, a broken person, I will lean towards excluding you and lifting myself up.
Right.
But I think the beauty of church leadership is that church leadership can look around and say, these are the widows of our community, everybody. These are the metaphoric or real widows. Let us care for them together, and let's join in their plight and allow them to serve us, and we'll serve them.
I was struck a while back about Paul's instructions about real widows. Isn't that an interesting text where he talks about the people whose families should be taking care of them and not the church?
Right. Well, I preached on it this week. So yes, he says that if you don't take care of your relatives, or at least the people in your own family, you're worse than an unbeliever. Right. Right. You're not living out your faith. And
it's
your faith.
And it's in the context of widows, actually specifically there.
Yes.
Which actually I've heard aimed at men. It's been aimed at me before. Back when I was planning the church, a an elder of another church said to me, he said, how much do you make? And I told him, and he said, wow, if you don't provide for your family, you're worse than an unbeliever. And it was that he used it as a manhood scale, which is interesting. And it often has been. And
it's read through a very individualistic.
And it's drawn right on out of its context.
Yes.
But that is interesting because it's like there's this idea of, what I hear you doing, you're framing the basic stuff about like sinful nature and self-centeredness and how we treat each other. And you're using the words, oppression and marginalization, which are valid as ways of describing how that works. And then there's this idea of responsibility. So in that text, it's like the one most responsible for this is the family, and it shouldn't trickle down. You shouldn't, abdicate that responsibility down to the church if you can do it.
Right.
And so then it's like whoever's most responsible to solve this marginalization problem should.
Yes.
And that buck shouldn't be passed.
Right.
And then the church, the broader community, is there for those who have no safety net.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, he says, honor widows who are truly in need.
Right.
And that's financially take care of the widows who really need it.
Yeah.
And families take care of the widows. And, by the way, all the way down in verse 16, rich women who have widows under them, don't turn them over to the church and burn in the church. If you've got the money and you have the widows, then you take care of them. Yeah.
Right.
So, there's individual familial responsibility, which makes, this is what is even more frustrating to me is, so for the last 500 years of the Protestant Reformation, how many denominations are there? And how many of us have our parents going to one community and our brother at the other community? I'm this person and I'm in another one. And so taking care, we're not joined together to take care of our family. My dad and my brothers don't all live next to me. And we're all one church plus maybe two other neighbors who've come over, and our slaves and our servants and our kids. And we all get together, or we are the slave. And
you're talking about more how the ancient household worked.
That's how it worked. And now we're so separated.
And it's all on you. Everybody has their own retirement account. If mom and dad didn't set one up, that's because they were irresponsible. You're not digging into my money.
Right.
And right. And there's but the same thing. Like, well, they go to that church. That deacons group isn't taking care of them. They're not going to come over here and suck ours dry.
Right.
It's tough because everything is so fragmented and individualistic already that it's really hard to build things that work the way that the Bible described it.
And we have to remember that, the early church, you've got, I think it's that the Jewish widows complain, or the Greek widows aren't being taken care of. Well, partly that's an overwhelmed staff, right? The apostles are overwhelmed.
Yeah, they were probably trying to do it,
but it's a problem.
It's a problem,
right? And it continues to be a problem. And human beings are human beings, and it doesn't have to just be widows, right? Because in those days, a widow was probably in her 20s or 30s. Today, the average age of a widow is 59, so it's a little bit different.
Well, I don't think it has to be just. Actually, I was writing my thesis last week, and I did some thinking about deacons within all of that, and read a little bit, and a couple of really incredible things show up. First of all, there's no reason to believe from the scriptures that deacons should always take care of widows. That just happened to be the problem that they had.
Sure.
And they ordained them to that task.
Right.
Then secondly, the amazing thing is here you're in a primarily Jewish church. Every deacon they ordained was Greek.
Right.
And so they had Greek names. So they ordained people of a different ethnicity entirely to take care of the widows of their ethnicity. So the solution to their problem was very tailored and leaned into the newfound and newly understood, diversity of the church, racial diversity of the church. So that's pretty interesting. But I do think that today you look at the problem that needs to be solved. A few years ago at our church, and it's actually kind of shifted, there were a few people with high amount of specific need and attention. And I really believed that our deacons needed to focus on them. That was the thing that kept creeping in, taking up the time of our of the pastors, and it felt very similar. Yeah. And they weren't necessarily widows.
Yeah.
And actually today that's a little less the case right now.
Sure.
So,
well, if we shift back to just for a moment to the actual thing that Cheppelle was talking about, I mean, gender dysphoria is a problem in our culture, and it's a problem in our churches.
Oh, no doubt.
And what we've decided is that either, we don't know what to do with it, or we need to get our children into therapy, which I'm not saying therapy is bad, but we really we don't have any answer for it as Christians and followers of Jesus. We don't know what to say to our kids. We don't know how to begin to walk alongside kids who are wrestling, because it's mostly kids right now.
Yeah, I've noticed this in the private school world that Abby's in, is that there's a lot of kids wrestling with it, and the schools don't have they're not clear at all on how to deal with it.
Oh yeah, and I mean,
it's kind of being treated similar to like cussing.
Yes.
It's like, just don't say that word.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we just have to get messy. We have to stop giving answers to everything and telling people over and over again that this is the right way and this is how we have to understand things. Yes, we do need to talk about those things, but no, like, relationship matters. Mm-hmm. Walking through things, listening to pain, but also begin to understand that the over-sexualization of our culture over the last 30 years is destroying our children.
Yeah.
We are now reaping the results where our children are either asexual, because it's terrifying. Sexuality is terrifying to them, or they're struggling with their gender because they can't find any footing, and they look at their parents and they're like, "You guys, you don't understand your gender. You're not giving me anything to stand on."
A lot of the kids I've noticed, the struggle begins around the same time that they get their first iPad or smartphone, within that year. Interestingly, because they're taking in a lot of media that's usually the parents don't have any grasp about.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I have all this figured out, because I do think that kids are going to have to use like media, and so you can't just keep them under a rock. And we've debated how much of that to do. And then the other piece I was thinking of, I read James K.A. Smith's book on education a while back, and his theory on kind of, teaching somebody what to worship through education was less. He was pushing back on the worldview teacher idea that you just teach the worldview. And he was saying it doesn't work. You need to teach the liturgy. You need to teach the movements and the habits of faith, not just the worldview. And if you were to push that over into the gender conversation, it would be inviting people in to experience like healthy relationships and gender, rather than just giving them facts. And I think that communities, churches could be very well equipped to do that. I don't know personally that I see schools. I'm a little fuzzy on what schools ought to be, doing.
Well, I mean, okay, so you're talking about Christian schools,
especially.
Yeah.
Schools that ascribe to statements of faith, their role isn't to be secondary week-long churches. Right. And some of them do behave as such.
Sure.
But they don't have creeds. They don't have ways of discipleship. They're there to teach math and science.
Right.
And so I think they get that kind of conflated.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, parental involvement.
Yeah.
I think, and I might get myself in trouble for this.
Oh boy.
But here we go. A lot less of reading your Bible, a lot less memorizing scripture with your kids, a lot less trying to make sure your kids know the way to salvation by the time they're 7, and a lot more talking about real life from little, processing their experiences and using context to teach them about Scripture, not decontextualizing things. And so
what I hear you saying in this is not a devaluing of the Bible or anything like that. I hear you saying, rather than just to think that to read Bible verses or just have a Bible time together, to think that that is discipling your kids in life as a Christian is a gross understatement, or underestimation of what that requires.
Well,
like, you would need to work out real life, having absorbed the truths of God's word and the Spirit yourself, and transmitting it that way.
Well, here's
am I on to?
Yes, I think you're on, and I want to tag on to what you were saying earlier about liturgy and creeds. Because honestly, I would rather have my kid at 17 years old not be able to explain to me really how you become a Christian, but tell me how deeply they love their church, be able to recite the creeds, and to know contextually what the church values, because then they are already following Jesus and they understand the complexity of a relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And they will get to the point where they can articulate maybe the road into the kingdom in a very simple or practical way as they are able to actually understand that in a more mature way.
Sure.
And because I think the habits of church and the communal habits of church change people, because kids who grow up in it, because kids are seeing mom and dad interact, and if it's communal, they're seeing the trials work themselves out. They're seeing it all practiced, and they're seeing it in the proclamations, and they're seeing it in the singing, and they're seeing it in the sermon, and they're seeing that they have a part.
Yeah.
Even if it's just like school in the sense that we'll have to be here because mom and dad are here, I'm doing it. I'm a part. And I think that's where the Village and Mission and other churches like this are built heavily in. They don't look like high church liturgy, but they're built in liturgy in the sense that they eat together. Right. They take communion every week together. They proclaim the word together. They speak creeds together. They spend time sitting across from each other after service and talking to each other. They run after children. But maybe they don't have Awana, and maybe they don't have Vacation Bible School, and maybe they don't have these very well laid out curriculums for the children. Right. Because the people and their relationship with Jesus are the curriculum.
I am sold on that. Yeah.
And
I want to do more of that in our church. Yeah.
And I don't think that's not a guarantee that if your child grows up in that church that they're going to walk away with Jesus, but I guarantee you Jesus will, in their mind and heart, Jesus will never leave. Yeah. Not that he leaves, but there's something very tangible, because that church is a place they can always come back to, and they know they have a place.
And it's built in. I've actually been really surprised in the last year to notice how much our daughter believes in what our church does.
Right.
And we visited a couple other churches when we were out of town, and she was just didn't understand.
Yeah.
And but in exploring that, it was because they didn't take the Lord's Supper even.
Right.
And they don't even eat. They just leave. And
there's some liturgical things that she doesn't understand.
But those are parts of the liturgy. That's the work of the people, right? Yeah. And she's come to see these are important. These shape me. And that's been cool. She's, I guess, one of the of all the people in our church, she has spent more formative years in it than any of the rest of us.
Right. And I think, so when I was a kid, apologetics were a big deal.
Right.
So
yes,
what happened was, there was the Creation Institute, which still exists.
Yeah.
And it's big, but it was more prominent in the forefront, and there were conferences and all this kind of stuff. And so we were trying to have this argument with evolution, right? Yeah. And that was the center, and we didn't want, and worldview, understanding your worldview and how it influenced, that was a huge deal. But what I think happened was what we should have been doing is having a much more come and see experience of you understand, creation and the world through science. come and meet the Creator.
Right.
Not there's a 6-day creation and the Bible. No, just come meet the Creator. And I think the message that we need to have now is not God created man and woman, Adam and Eve, not Steve and Steve, or not a fluid, Steve and Betty and one person. We're not having that. Instead of having that conversation and trying to explain how gender is fixed
and differentiate between us and them.
Saying, come and meet the one who created you.
Yeah,
that's all. Come meet the person who created you.
And see what happens. See what happens.
See what he's like.
Yeah. Because
your gender and what it is, it doesn't matter as much as knowing the one who created you.
Well, think about how many, and this is just to Christians out there, think about how many of your disordered, cares and desires, still persist as a Christian, that Jesus is chipping away at day by day.
Right.
And it's happening because you're in his presence and you're with his people. Wouldn't the same be true of gender dysphoria? Right?
Yeah. Well, and I think it would change if our people were much more either come and see, and not the come and see, come to my church, come and see me.
Yeah, walk with me.
Come listen. I was talking to my daughter this morning, and we were talking about one of her friends, and I said, hey, you just need to sit down with this person and say, hey, can I read scripture with you and pray over you? I know you're having a hard time, and I know that you're interested in God, so can I do that for you? Because I know you're not in a good place. That is, that's her saying, you come see the Creator. Let him sort things out for you with me. That's the answer to transgenderism. That's the answer to almost anything.
Yeah.
But that means that you and I have to live in a very full liturgical life, in the sense of life full of practice with Jesus, a full, I can't say to anyone, come see how I love my wife, if I never do anything with my wife, right? If I never care about her, never go on a date, never serve her, never home to see her, she's not really my wife outside of the law.
Right.
And there's no relationship. It's the same. We need people in this constant relationship with God, and an understanding that everyone around them, it's like, come see what this is like. But yeah, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it's really easy for us to say, and that's my burden. I need to take the burden that person has and put it on me and hope that they'll find Jesus, instead of just being like, no, Jesus' burden. He'll take your burden. I don't need to take it. Just come see what he does with us.
Yeah.
The burden's light. Your gender doesn't have to burden you.
Yeah.
Anyway, I could get preaching real fast.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So, well, Eric, thanks, man. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. Oh, so we should say, or we can say at the beginning. We'll say at the beginning.
Yeah. Let's just say for now, hey, thanks for joining us.
And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. And you can always reach out to us at faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. And if you're in a really great mood right now, and you want to go give us a review, that'd be amazing, because that, helps people find us, which is why we're able to afford these amazing jackets.
One that I've been wearing for like 4 years.
Yeah, I bought this one at a thrift store like 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah. All right, thanks.
Okay. You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.